Yes, so one of the ideas I wish to comment on that Weininger mentioned, you can see along there, that's a wallaby track, is, I'll take the wallaby track. This idea of non-empirical psychology, which is not a very popular idea, but it's actually quite valid. And empirical psychology is actually insane if you think about it. Oops. Careful. Here's the footpad. Yes, non-biological, non-physiological psychology is basically one that's based on a Weltanschauung that's constructed internally. That is basically an understanding of reality. And understanding of what's ultimately real, ultimate reality. And this is an idea that Weininger's obviously based the whole of his Sex and Character on, is basically your philosophy, your values, your morality. It comes from this understanding of what's ultimately real. This is what he refers to as that primary source that exists, that is, even if there were no human beings to perceive it. Since ultimate reality continues whether there's consciousness or not, it's not an empirical thing, it's not observed. It's responsible for consciousness and everything else. So this is what he's talking about in the non-empirical psychology. Is basically your value system comes from this unchanging and permanent essence to all existence. And what he's saying is that a biological empirical psychology is basically trying to determine what is sanity relative to your society, relative to changing and finite things. So it is insane, and it doesn't work. It basically says that you're a decent and noble moral individual if you conform to your society, and that's basically as the psychologists have it. Oops, almost fell off. So this is the first idea. He's basically vindicating, as he said, the rights of a non-empirical psychology. Where does the footpad go now? I think it might go this way. And the other idea was, people often have this knee-jerk reaction to Weininger as an anti-Semite, simply because he criticises Jewishness. Really, who better to criticise Jewishness than a Jew? Why can't you criticise Jewishness? Why can't you criticise any culture? And this is, he wasn't a Nazi. He wasn't advocating genocide or eugenics. I mean, he wrote about anti-Semitism as the hatred for traits one has oneself and tries to flee from, segregate oneself from by projecting them onto other people. You can blame someone else more easily than you can take responsibility for the problem yourself. That's what he called anti-Semitism. It's essentially this kind of criminal mentality of not taking responsibility. He just happened to call it Jewishness because he saw Jews in his time as the strongest, most clearest examples of it, just as he regarded women to have the strongest demonstrations of a will to unconsciousness, a will to unreason, if you can speak of a will, when there's no consciousness.
Pseudoscience consists of statements, beliefs, or practices that are claimed to be both scientific and factual, but are incompatible with the scientific method. Pseudoscience is often characterized by contradictory, exaggerated or unfalsifiable claims, reliance on confirmation bias rather than rigorous attempts at refutation, lack of openness to evaluation by other experts, an absence of systematic practices when developing theories, and continued adherence long after they have been experimentally discredited. The term pseudoscience is considered pejorative because it suggests something is being presented as science inaccurately or even deceptively. Those described as practicing or advocating pseudoscience often dispute the characterization. The demarcation between science and pseudoscience has philosophical and scientific implications. Differentiating science from pseudoscience has practical implications in the case of health care, expert testimony, environmental policies, and science education. Distinguishing scientific facts and theories from pseudoscientific beliefs, such as those found in astrology, alchemy, alternative medicine, occult beliefs, and creation science, is part of science education and scientific literacy. Pseudoscience can cause negative consequences in the real world. Anti-vaccine activists present pseudoscientific studies that falsely call into question the safety of vaccines. Homeopathic remedies with no active ingredients have been promoted as treatment for deadly diseases. Topic: Etymology. The word pseudoscience is derived from the Greek root pseudo meaning false and the English word science, from the Latin word scientia, meaning knowledge. Although the term has been in use since at least the late 18th century, e.g. in 1796 by James Pettit Andrews in reference to alchemy, the concept of pseudoscience as distinct from real or proper science seems to have become more widespread during the mid-19th century. Among the earliest uses of pseudoscience was in an 1844 article in the Northern Journal of Medicine, issue 387, that opposite kind of innovation which pronounces what has been recognized as a branch of science, to have been a pseudo-science, composed merely of so-called facts, connected together by misapprehensions under the disguise of principles. An earlier use of the term was in 1843 by the French physiologist François Magendie. During the 20th century, the word was used pejoratively to describe explanations of phenomena which were claimed to be scientific, but which were not in fact supported by reliable experimental evidence. From time to time, though, the usage of the word occurred in a more formal, technical manner in response to a perceived threat to individual and institutional security in a social and cultural setting. Topic: Classification. Philosophers classify types of knowledge. In English, the word science is used to indicate specifically the natural sciences and related fields, which are called the social sciences. Different philosophers of science may disagree on the exact limits. For example, is mathematics a formal science that is closer to the empirical ones, or is pure mathematics closer to the philosophical study of logic and therefore not a science? But all agree that all of the ideas that are not scientific are non-scientific. The large category of non-science includes all matters outside the natural and social sciences, such as the study of history, metaphysics, religion, art, and the humanities. Dividing the category again, unscientific claims are a subset of the large category of non-scientific claims. This category specifically includes all matters that are directly opposed to good science. Unscience includes both bad science, such as an error made in a good faith attempt at learning something about the natural world, and pseudoscience. Thus pseudoscience is a subset of unscience, and unscience, in turn, is subset of non-science. Relationship to science. Pseudoscience is differentiated from science because, although it claims to be science, pseudoscience does not adhere to accepted scientific standards, such as the scientific method, falsifiability of claims, and Mertonian norms. Scientific method. A number of basic principles are accepted by scientists as standards for determining whether a body of knowledge, method, or practice is scientific. Experimental results should be reproducible and verified by other researchers. These principles are intended to ensure experiments can be reproduced measurably given the same conditions, allowing further investigation to determine whether a hypothesis or theory related to given phenomena is valid and reliable. Standards require the scientific method to be applied throughout, and bias to be controlled for or eliminated through randomization, fair sampling procedures, blinding of studies, and other methods. All gathered data, including the experimental or environmental conditions, are expected to be documented for scrutiny and made available for peer review, allowing further experiments or studies to be conducted to confirm or falsify results. Statistical quantification of significance, confidence, and error are also important tools for the scientific method. Falsifiability. During the mid-20th century, the philosopher Karl Popper emphasized the criterion of falsifiability to distinguish science from non-science. Statements, hypotheses, or theories have falsifiability or refutability if there is the inherent possibility that they can be proven false. That is, if it is possible to conceive of an observation or an argument which negates them. Popper used astrology and psychoanalysis as examples of pseudoscience and Einstein's theory of relativity as an example of science. He subdivided non-science into philosophical, mathematical, mythological, religious and metaphysical formulations on one hand, and pseudoscientific formulations on the other, though he did not provide clear criteria for the differences. Another example which shows the distinct need for a claim to be falsifiable was stated in Carl Sagan's publication The Demon-Haunted World when he discusses an invisible dragon that he has in his garage. The point is made that there is no physical test to refute the claim of the presence of this dragon. No matter what test you think you can devise, there is then a reason why this does not apply to the invisible dragon, so one can never prove that the initial claim is wrong. Sagan concludes, "Now, what's the difference between an invisible, incorporeal, floating dragon who spits heatless fire and no dragon at all?" He states that, Your inability to invalidate my hypothesis is not at all the same thing as proving it true." Once again explaining that even if such a claim were true, it would be outside the realm of scientific inquiry. Mertonian norms. During 1942, Robert K. Merton identified a set of 5 norms, which he characterized as what makes a real science. If any of the norms were violated, Merton considered the enterprise to be non-science. These are not broadly accepted by the scientific community. His norms were: originality, the tests and research done must present something new to the scientific community. Detachment, the scientists' reasons for practicing this science must be simply for the expansion of their knowledge. The scientists should not have personal reasons to expect certain results. Universality, no person should be able to more easily obtain the information of a test than another person. Social class, religion, ethnicity, or any other personal factors should not be factors in someone's ability to receive or perform a type of science. Skepticism, scientific facts must not be based on faith. One should always question every case and argument and constantly check for errors or invalid claims. Public accessibility, any scientific knowledge one obtains should be made available to everyone. The results of any research should be published and shared with the scientific community. Refusal to acknowledge problems. During 1978, Paul Thagard proposed that pseudoscience is primarily distinguishable from science when it is less progressive than alternative theories over a long period of time, and its proponents fail to acknowledge or address problems with the theory. During 1983, Mario Bunge has suggested the categories of belief fields and research fields to help distinguish between pseudoscience and science, where the former is primarily personal and subjective and the latter involves a certain systematic method. Criticism of the term. Philosophers of science such as Paul Feyerabend argued that a distinction between science and non-science is neither possible nor desirable. Among the issues which can make the distinction difficult is variable rates of evolution among the theories and methods of science in response to new data. Larry Loudon has suggested pseudoscience has no scientific meaning and is mostly used to describe our emotions. If we would stand up and be counted on the side of reason, we ought to drop terms like pseudoscience and unscientific from our vocabulary. They are just hollow phrases which do only emotive work for us. Likewise, Richard McNally states, "The term pseudoscience has become little more than an inflammatory buzzword for quickly dismissing one's opponents in media sound bites." And when therapeutic entrepreneurs make claims on behalf of their interventions, we should not waste our time trying to determine whether their interventions qualify as pseudoscientific. Rather, we should ask them, how do you know that your intervention works? What is your evidence? Alternative definition. For philosophers Silvio Funtevich and Jerome R. Ravitz, Pseudoscience may be defined as one where the uncertainty of its inputs must be suppressed, lest they render its outputs totally indeterminate. The definition, in the book Uncertainty and Quality in Science for Policy p. 54, alludes to the loss of craft skills in handling quantitative information, and to the bad practice of achieving precision in prediction inference only at the expenses of ignoring uncertainty in the input which was used to formulate the prediction. This use of the term is common among practitioners of post-normal science. Understood in this way, pseudoscience can be fought using good practices to assesses uncertainty in quantitative information, such as NUSAP and, in the case of mathematical modeling, sensitivity auditing. History. The history of pseudoscience is the study of pseudoscientific theories over time. A pseudoscience is a set of ideas that presents itself as science, while it does not meet the criteria to be properly called such. Distinguishing between proper science and pseudoscience is sometimes difficult. One proposal for demarcation between the two is the falsification criterion, attributed most notably to the philosopher Karl Popper. In the history of science and the history of pseudoscience it can be especially difficult to separate the two, because some sciences developed from pseudosciences. An example of this transformation is the science chemistry, which traces its origins to pseudo-scientific or pre-scientific study of alchemy. The vast diversity in pseudosciences further complicates the history of science. Some modern pseudosciences, such as astrology and acupuncture, originated before the scientific era. Others developed as part of an ideology, such as Lysenkoism, or as a response to perceived threats to an ideology. Examples of this ideological process are creation science and intelligent design, which were developed in response to the scientific theory of evolution. Identifying. A topic, practice, or body of knowledge might reasonably be termed pseudoscientific when it is presented as consistent with the norms of scientific research, but it demonstrably fails to meet these norms. Karl Popper stated it is insufficient to distinguish science from pseudoscience, or from metaphysics, such as the philosophical question of what existence means, by the criterion of rigorous adherence to the empirical method, which is essentially inductive, based on observation or experimentation. He proposed a method to distinguish between genuine empirical, non-empirical or even pseudo-empirical methods. The latter case was exemplified by astrology, which appeals to observation and experimentation. While it had astonishing empirical evidence based on observation, on horoscopes and biographies, it crucially failed to use acceptable scientific standards. Popper proposed falsifiability as an important criterion in distinguishing science from pseudoscience. To demonstrate this point, Popper gave two cases of human behavior and typical explanations from Sigmund Freud and Alfred Adler's theories. That of a man who pushes a child into the water with the intention of drowning it, and that of a man who sacrifices his life in an attempt to save the child. From Freud's perspective, the first man would have suffered from psychological repression, probably originating from an Oedipus complex, whereas the second man had attained sublimation. From Adler's perspective, the first and second man suffered from feelings of inferiority and had to prove himself, which drove him to commit the crime or, in the second case, drove him to rescue the child. Popper was not able to find any counterexamples of human behavior in which the behavior could not be explained in the terms of Adler's or Freud's theory. Popper argued it was that the observation always fitted or confirmed the theory which, rather than being its strength, was actually its weakness. In contrast, Popper gave the example of Einstein's gravitational theory, which predicted light must be attracted by heavy bodies such as the Sun, precisely as material bodies were attracted. Following from this, stars closer to the Sun would appear to have moved a small distance away from the Sun, and away from each other. This prediction was particularly striking to Popper because it involved considerable risk. The brightness of the Sun prevented this effect from being observed under normal circumstances, so photographs had to be taken during an eclipse and compared to photographs taken at night. Popper states, "If observation shows that the predicted effect is definitely absent, then the theory is simply refuted." Popper summed up his criterion for the scientific status of a theory as depending on its falsifiability, refutability, or testability. Paul R. Thagard used astrology as a case study to distinguish science from pseudoscience and proposed principles and criteria to delineate them. First, astrology has not progressed in that it has not been updated nor added any explanatory power since Ptolemy. Second, it has ignored outstanding problems such as the precession of equinoxes in astronomy. Third, alternative theories of personality and behavior have grown progressively to encompass explanations of phenomena which astrology statically attributes to heavenly forces. Fourth, astrologers have remained uninterested in furthering the theory to deal with outstanding problems or in critically evaluating the theory in relation to other theories. Thagard intended this criterion to be extended to areas other than astrology. He believed it would delineate as pseudo-scientific such practices as witchcraft and pyramidology, while leaving physics, chemistry and biology in the realm of science. Biorhythms, which like astrology relied uncritically on birth dates, did not meet the criterion of pseudoscience at the time because there were no alternative explanations for the same observations. The use of this criterion has the consequence that a theory can be scientific at one time and pseudoscientific at a later time. Science is also distinguishable from revelation, theology, or spirituality in that it offers insight into the physical world obtained by empirical research and testing. The most notable disputes concern the evolution of living organisms, the idea of common descent, the geologic history of the Earth, the formation of the Solar System, and the origin of the universe. Systems of belief that derive from divine or inspired knowledge are not considered pseudoscience if they do not claim either to be scientific or to overturn well-established science. Moreover, some specific religious claims, such as the power of intercessory prayer to heal the sick, although they may be based on untestable beliefs, can be tested by the scientific method. Some statements and common beliefs of popular science may not meet the criteria of science. Pop science may blur the divide between science and pseudoscience among the general public, and may also involve science fiction. Indeed, pop science is disseminated to, and can also easily emanate from, persons not accountable to scientific methodology and expert peer review. If the claims of a given field can be tested experimentally and standards are upheld, it is not pseudoscience, however odd, astonishing, or counterintuitive the claims are. If claims made are inconsistent with existing experimental results or established theory, but the method is sound, caution should be used, since science consists of testing hypotheses which may turn out to be false. In such a case, the work may be better described as ideas that are not yet generally accepted. Protoscience is a term sometimes used to describe a hypothesis that has not yet been tested adequately by the scientific method, but which is otherwise consistent with existing science or which, where inconsistent, offers reasonable account of the inconsistency. It may also describe the transition from a body of practical knowledge into a scientific field. Topic: Indicators of the possible presence of pseudoscience. Topic: Use of vague, exaggerated or untestable claims. Assertion of scientific claims that are vague rather than precise, and that lack specific measurements. Assertion of a claim with little or no explanatory power. Failure to make use of operational definitions, i.e., publicly accessible definitions of the variables, terms, or objects of interest so that persons other than the definer can measure or test them independently. See also, reproducibility. Failure to make reasonable use of the principle of parsimony, i.e., failing to seek an explanation that requires the fewest possible additional assumptions when multiple viable explanations are possible. See, Occam's razor. Use of obscurantist language, and use of apparently technical jargon in an effort to give claims the superficial trappings of science. Lack of boundary conditions. Most well-supported scientific theories possess well-articulated limitations under which the predicted phenomena do and do not apply. Lack of effective controls, such as placebo and double-blind, in experimental design. Lack of understanding of basic and established principles of physics and engineering. Topic: Over-reliance on confirmation rather than refutation. Assertions that do not allow the logical possibility that they can be shown to be false by observation or physical experiment. See also, falsifiability. Assertion of claims that a theory predicts something that it has not been shown to predict. Scientific claims that do not confer any predictive power are considered at best conjectures, or at worst pseudoscience, e.g., ignoratio elenchi. Assertion that claims which have not been proven false must therefore be true, and vice versa. See, argument from ignorance. Over-reliance on testimonial, anecdotal evidence, or personal experience. This evidence may be useful for the context of discovery, i.e., hypothesis generation, but should not be used in the context of justification, e.g., statistical hypothesis testing. Presentation of data that seems to support claims while suppressing or refusing to consider data that conflict with those claims. This is an example of selection bias, a distortion of evidence or data that arises from the way that the data are collected. It is sometimes referred to as the selection effect. promulgating to the status of facts excessive or untested claims that have been previously published elsewhere, an accumulation of such in critical secondary reports, which do not otherwise contribute their own empirical investigation, is called the Woozle effect. Reversed burden of proof – science places the burden of proof on those making a claim, not on the critic. Pseudo-scientific arguments may neglect this principle and demand that skeptics demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that a claim, e.g., an assertion regarding the efficacy of a novel therapeutic technique, is false. It is essentially impossible to prove a universal negative, so this tactic incorrectly places the burden of proof on the skeptic rather than on the claimant. Appeals to holism as opposed to reductionism. Proponents of pseudoscientific claims, especially in organic medicine, alternative medicine, naturopathy and mental health, often resort to the mantra of holism to dismiss negative findings. Topic: Lack of openness to testing by other experts. Evasion of peer review before publicizing results, termed science by press conference. Some proponents of ideas that contradict accepted scientific theories avoid subjecting their ideas to peer review, sometimes on the grounds that peer review is biased towards established paradigms, and sometimes on the grounds that assertions cannot be evaluated adequately using standard scientific methods. By remaining insulated from the peer review process, these proponents forego the opportunity of corrective feedback from informed colleagues. Some agencies, institutions, and publications that fund scientific research require authors to share data so others can evaluate a paper independently. Failure to provide adequate information for other researchers to reproduce the claims contributes to a lack of openness. Appealing to the need for secrecy or proprietary knowledge when an independent review of data or methodology is requested. Substantive debate on the evidence by knowledgeable proponents of all viewpoints is not encouraged. Absence of progress. Failure to progress towards additional evidence of its claims. Terence Hines has identified astrology as a subject that has changed very little in the past 2 millennia. See also, scientific progress. Lack of self-correction. Scientific research programs make mistakes, but they tend to reduce these errors over time. By contrast, ideas may be regarded as pseudo-scientific because they have remained unaltered despite contradictory evidence. The work Scientists Confront Velikovsky 1976, Cornell University, also delves into these features in some detail, as does the work of Thomas Kuhn, e.g., The Structure of Scientific Revolutions 1962, which also discusses some of the items on the list of characteristics of pseudoscience. Statistical significance of supporting experimental results does not improve over time and are usually close to the cutoff for statistical significance. Normally, experimental techniques improve or the experiments are repeated, and this gives ever stronger evidence. If statistical significance does not improve, this typically shows the experiments have just been repeated until a success occurs due to chance variations. Topic: Personalization of issues. tight social groups and authoritarian personality, suppression of dissent and groupthink can enhance the adoption of beliefs that have no rational basis. In attempting to confirm their beliefs, the group tends to identify their critics as enemies. Assertion of claims of a conspiracy on the part of the scientific community to suppress the results. Attacking the motives or character of anyone who questions the claims, see ad hominem fallacy. Topic: Use of misleading language. Creating scientific-sounding terms to persuade non-experts to believe statements that may be false or meaningless. For example, a long-standing hoax refers to water by the rarely used formal name, dihydrogen monoxide, and describes it as the main constituent in most poisonous solutions to show how easily the general public can be misled. Using established terms in idiosyncratic ways, thereby demonstrating unfamiliarity with mainstream work in the discipline. Topic: Prevalence of pseudoscientific beliefs in the United States. A large percentage of the United States population lacks scientific literacy, not adequately understanding scientific principles and method. In the Journal of College Science Teaching, Art Hobson writes, "Pseudoscientific beliefs are surprisingly widespread in our culture even among public school science teachers and newspaper editors, and are closely related to scientific illiteracy." However, a 10,000-student study in the same journal concluded there was no strong correlation between science knowledge and belief in pseudoscience. In his book The Demon-Haunted World, Carl Sagan discusses the government of China and the Chinese Communist Party's concern about Western pseudoscience developments and certain ancient Chinese practices in China. He sees pseudoscience occurring in the United States as part of a worldwide trend and suggests its causes, dangers, diagnosis, and treatment may be universal. During 2006, the U.S. National Science Foundation (NSF) issued an executive summary of a paper on science and engineering which briefly discussed the prevalence of pseudoscience in modern times. It said, "Belief in pseudoscience is widespread," and, referencing a Gallup poll, stated that belief in the 10 commonly believed examples of paranormal phenomena listed in the poll were pseudoscientific beliefs. The items were extrasensory perception (ESP), that houses can be haunted, ghosts, telepathy, clairvoyance, astrology, that people can communicate mentally with someone who has died, witches, reincarnation, and channeling. Such beliefs in pseudoscience represent a lack of knowledge of how science works. The scientific community may attempt to communicate information about science out of concern for the public's susceptibility to unproven claims. The National Science Foundation stated that pseudoscientific beliefs in the U.S. became more widespread during the 1990s, peaked about 2001, and then decreased slightly since, with pseudoscientific beliefs remaining common. According to the NSF report, there is a lack of knowledge of pseudoscientific issues in society and pseudoscientific practices are commonly followed. Surveys indicate about a third of all adult Americans consider astrology to be scientific. Topic: Explanations. In a report, Singer and Benassi (1981) wrote that pseudoscientific beliefs have their origin from at least 4 sources. Common cognitive errors from personal experience. Erroneous sensationalistic mass media coverage. Sociocultural factors. Poor or erroneous science education. Another American study, Eve and Dunn, 1990, supported the findings of Singer and Benassi and found pseudoscientific belief being promoted by high school life science and biology teachers. Topic: Psychology. The psychology of pseudoscience attempts to explore and analyze pseudoscientific thinking by means of thorough clarification on making the distinction of what is considered scientific versus pseudoscientific. The human proclivity for seeking confirmation rather than refutation, confirmation bias, the tendency to hold comforting beliefs, and the tendency to overgeneralize have been proposed as reasons for pseudoscientific thinking. According to Bayerstein 1991, humans are prone to associations based on resemblances only, and often prone to misattribution in cause-effect thinking. Michael Shermer's theory of belief-dependent realism is driven by the belief that the brain is essentially a belief engine, which scans data perceived by the senses and looks for patterns and meaning. There is also the tendency for the brain to create cognitive biases, as a result of inferences and assumptions made without logic and based on instinct, usually resulting in patterns in cognition. These tendencies of patternicity and agenticity are also driven by a meta-bias called the bias blind spot, or the tendency to recognize the power of cognitive biases in other people but to be blind to their influence on our own beliefs. Lindemann states that social motives, i.e., to comprehend self and the world, to have a sense of control over outcomes, to belong, to find the world benevolent and to maintain one's self-esteem, are often more easily fulfilled by pseudoscience than by scientific information. Furthermore, pseudoscientific explanations are generally not analyzed rationally, but instead experientially. Operating within a different set of rules compared to rational thinking, experiential thinking regards an explanation as valid if the explanation is personally functional, satisfying and sufficient, offering a description of the world that may be more personal than can be provided by science and reducing the amount of potential work involved in understanding complex events and outcomes. There is a trend to believe in pseudoscience more than scientific evidence. Some people believe the prevalence of pseudoscientific beliefs is due to widespread scientific illiteracy. Individuals lacking scientific literacy are more susceptible to wishful thinking, since they are likely to turn to immediate gratification powered by System 1, our default operating system, which requires little to no effort. This system encourages one to accept the conclusions they believe, and reject the ones they do not. Further analysis of complex pseudoscientific phenomena require System 2, which follows rules, compares objects along multiple dimensions and weighs options. These two systems have several other differences which are further discussed in the dual process theory. The scientific and secular systems of morality and meaning are generally unsatisfying to most people. Humans are, by nature, a forward-minded species pursuing greater avenues of happiness and satisfaction, but we are all too frequently willing to grasp at unrealistic promises of a better life. Psychology has much to discuss about pseudoscience thinking, as it is the illusory perceptions of causality and effectiveness of numerous individuals that needs to be illuminated. Research suggests that illusionary thinking happens in most people when exposed to certain circumstances such as reading a book, an advertisement or the testimony of others are the basis of pseudoscience beliefs. It is assumed that illusions are not unusual, and given the right conditions, illusions are able to occur systematically even in normal emotional situations. One of the things pseudoscience believers quibble most about is that academic science usually treats them as fools. Minimizing these illusions in the real world is not simple. To this aim, designing evidence-based educational programs can be effective to help people identify and reduce their own illusions. Topic: Boundaries with science. In the Philosophy and History of Science, Imre Lakatos stresses the social and political importance of the demarcation problem, the normative methodological problem of distinguishing between science and pseudoscience. His distinctive historical analysis of scientific methodology based on research programs suggests, "Scientists regard the successful theoretical prediction of stunning novel facts, such as the return of Halley's comet or the gravitational bending of light rays, as what demarcates good scientific theories from pseudo-scientific and degenerate theories, and in spite of all scientific theories being forever confronted by an ocean of counterexamples." Lakatos offers a novel fallibilist analysis of the development of Newton's celestial dynamics, his favorite historical example of his methodology, and argues in light of this historical turn, that his account answers for certain inadequacies in those of Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn. Nonetheless, Lakatos did recognize the force of Kuhn's historical criticism of Popper. All important theories have been surrounded by an ocean of anomalies, which on a falsificationist view would require the rejection of the theory outright. Lakatos sought to reconcile the rationalism of Popperian falsificationism with what seemed to be its own refutation by history. Many philosophers have tried to solve the problem of demarcation in the following terms: a statement constitutes knowledge if sufficiently many people believe it sufficiently strongly. But the history of thought shows us that many people were totally committed to absurd beliefs. If the strengths of beliefs were a hallmark of knowledge, we should have to rank some tales about demons, angels, devils, and of heaven and hell as knowledge. Scientists, on the other hand, are very skeptical even of their best theories. Newton's is the most powerful theory science has yet produced, but Newton himself never believed that bodies attract each other at a distance. So no degree of commitment to beliefs makes them knowledge. Indeed, the hallmark of scientific behavior is a certain skepticism even towards one's most cherished theories. Blind commitment to a theory is not an intellectual virtue, it is an intellectual crime. Thus a statement may be pseudoscientific even if it is eminently plausible and everybody believes in it, and it may be scientifically valuable even if it is unbelievable and nobody believes in it. A theory may even be of supreme scientific value even if no one understands it, let alone believes in it. The boundary between science and pseudoscience is disputed and difficult to determine analytically, even after more than a century of study by philosophers of science and scientists, and despite some basic agreements on the fundamentals of the scientific method. The concept of pseudoscience rests on an understanding that the scientific method has been misrepresented or misapplied with respect to a given theory, but many philosophers of science maintain that different kinds of methods are held as appropriate across different fields and different eras of human history. According to Lakatos, the typical descriptive unit of great scientific achievements is not an isolated hypothesis but a powerful problem-solving machinery, which, with the help of sophisticated mathematical techniques, digests anomalies and even turns them into positive evidence. To Popper, pseudoscience uses induction to generate theories, and only performs experiments to seek to verify them. To Popper, falsifiability is what determines the scientific status of a theory. Taking a historical approach, Kuhn observed that scientists did not follow Popper's rule, and might ignore falsifying data, unless overwhelming. To Kuhn, puzzle solving within a paradigm is science. Lakatos attempted to resolve this debate, by suggesting history shows that science occurs in research programs, competing according to how progressive they are. The leading idea of a program could evolve, driven by its heuristic to make predictions that can be supported by evidence. Feyerabend claimed that Lakatos was selective in his examples, and the whole history of science shows there is no universal rule of scientific method, and imposing one on the scientific community impedes progress. Loudon maintained that the demarcation between science and non-science was a pseudo-problem, preferring to focus on the more general distinction between reliable and unreliable knowledge. Feyerabend regards Lakatos's view as being closet anarchism disguised as methodological rationalism. It should be noted that Feyerabend's claim was not that standard methodological rules should never be obeyed, but rather that sometimes progress is made by abandoning them. In the absence of a generally accepted rule, there is a need for alternative methods of persuasion. According to Feyerabend, Galileo employed stylistic and rhetorical techniques to convince his reader, while he also wrote in Italian rather than Latin and directed his arguments to those already temperamentally inclined to accept them. Politics, health, and education. Political implications. The demarcation problem between science and pseudoscience brings up debate in the realms of science, philosophy and politics. Imre Lakatos, for instance, points out that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union at one point declared that Mendelian genetics was pseudoscientific and had its advocates, including well-established scientists such as Nikolai Vavilov, sent to a gulag, and that the liberal establishment of the West denies freedom of speech to topics it regards as pseudoscience, particularly where they run up against social mores. It becomes pseudoscientific when science cannot be separated from ideology. Scientists misrepresent scientific findings to promote or draw attention for publicity, when politicians, journalists, and a nation's intellectual elite distort the facts of science for short-term political political gain, or when powerful individuals of the public conflate causation and cofactors by clever wordplay. These ideas reduce the authority, value, integrity and independence of science in society. Topic: Health and education implications. Distinguishing science from pseudoscience has practical implications in the case of health care, expert testimony, environmental policies, and science education. Treatments with a patina of scientific authority which have not actually been subjected to actual scientific testing may be ineffective, expensive and dangerous to patients and confuse health providers, insurers, government decision makers and the public as to what treatments are appropriate. Claims advanced by pseudoscience may result in government officials and educators making bad decisions in selecting curricula. The extent to which students acquire a range of social and cognitive thinking skills related to the proper usage of science and technology determines whether they are scientifically literate. Education in the sciences encounters new dimensions with the changing landscape of science and technology, a fast-changing culture and a knowledge-driven era. A reinvention of the school science curriculum is one that shapes students to contend with its changing influence on human welfare. Scientific literacy, which allows a person to distinguish science from pseudosciences such as astrology, is among the attributes that enable students to adapt to the changing world. Its characteristics are embedded in a curriculum where students are engaged in resolving problems, conducting investigations, or developing projects. Friedman mentions why most scientists avoid educating about pseudoscience, including that paying undue attention to pseudoscience could dignify it. On the other hand, Park emphasizes how pseudoscience can be a threat to society and considers that scientists have a responsibility to teach how to distinguish science from pseudoscience. Pseudosciences such as homeopathy, even if generally benign, are used by charlatans. This poses a serious issue because it enables incompetent practitioners to administer health care. True believing zealots may pose a more serious threat than typical con men because of their affection to homeopathy's ideology. Irrational health care is not harmless and it is careless to create patient confidence in pseudomedicine. On December 8, 2016, Michael V. Levine, writing in Business Insider, pointed out the dangers posed by the Natural News website. Snake oil salesmen have pushed false cures since the dawn of medicine, and now websites like Natural News flood social media with dangerous anti-pharmaceutical, anti-vaccination and anti-GMO pseudoscience that puts millions at risk of contracting preventable illnesses. The anti-vaccine movement has persuaded large number of parents not to vaccinate their children, citing pseudoscientific research that links childhood vaccines with the onset of autism. These include the study by Andrew Wakefield, which claimed that a combination of gastrointestinal disease and developmental regression, which are often seen in children with ASD, occurred within 2 weeks of receiving vaccines. The study was eventually retracted by its publisher while Wakefield was stripped of his license to practice medicine. See also Related concepts. Anti-science, climate change denial, credulity, Factoid. Junk science. List of topics characterized as pseudoscience. Not even wrong. Topic: Similar terms. Normative science. Pseudolaw. Pseudomathematics. Notes.
We live in a time where science plays an important role in society. We also live in a time of scientific pluralism, and there are big divides and disagreements among scientific positions. At the same time, science is going into more fields, involving more researchers and using a larger repertoire of methodologies and methods than ever before. Furthermore, we live in a knowledge society where there is conflicting interest and conflicting knowledge, but where we are also dependent on a common reason.
How can science be diverse and contribute to pluralism in society and at the same time provide valid knowledge? In order to try to answer this question, I will take you on a journey through the history of European science and make a few stops on the way and look at how philosophers and scientists at different times have tried to understand what science is.
In this first part of our journey, we will look at how science emerged in the antiquity, how it was rediscovered in the medieval time, and how it gradually became an independent institution in society. Along the route, we will look at how science has been understood and conceptualized. The roots of today's science can be found in Greece, in the antiquity, at the Academy in Athens around 350 BC. The Academy was founded by Plato and was a school for higher education. It got its name from the place in which it was located, a place that was dedicated to Athena, the goddess of wisdom. One of the Academy's most prominent students was Aristotle. The works of Plato and Aristotle would become the most important references for science up to modern time.
They were struggling with trying to understand this whole phenomenon of general concepts. Where are they? What are they? Are they real? Are they not? So it was that was not only a controversy but a discussion that has followed, science and philosophy for 2,000 years.
This discussion should turn about to be the first big controversy in science that still defines some of its most fundamental disagreements. The Renaissance painter Raphael captured this disagreement between Plato and Aristotle in his painting of the Academy, letting Plato point upwards towards the ideas, while Aristotle points downwards at nature. What was this disagreement about? And why is it so important? As we shall see, the disagreement would be a major divide in scientific reasoning up to modern times.
There were differences, obviously. I mean, Plato was very much concerned with his own conception of ideas or forms that were, in a way, standards of measurement for things here on Earth. There was for horses and human beings and everything, there was a sort of ideal type idea existing separately. And Aristotle was very much in disagreement with this. He had a different thoughts about the status of these forms or ideas.
The disagreement escalated because it had also implications for how to do science. Plato believed in reasoning from ideas. Aristotle believed that in order to understand the forces that govern nature, we need to study nature itself. And for some reason, this disagreement led Aristotle to the Greek island of Lesbos.
It's quite a coincidence why Aristotle ended up here in Colony Bay. The story is told that it was a dispute with the nephew of Plato, Speusippus, when he took over the academy in 347 before Christ. And the dispute was about methodology. If that is the case, it's actually the first big methodological dispute in science. He came here because his student, Theophrastus, lived in this island, and Theophrastus was interested in botany. Here Aristotle discovered biology because obvious of the fantastic wildlife and animal life and sea life that he discovered in this bay. And together they made works that became reference for these fields, these scientific fields, for centuries after.
Aristotle wrote several books where he classified political systems, literature, ethics, and nature.
So Aristotle was actually the first to systematically start to research the natural world in a way, in a scientific way, if you like.
Plato believed that we can know how things logically have to be, even if we cannot observe them. Aristotle used his observation to put both the nature and the human world into categories that would reveal the natural order of things. And he described this eternal order. So, in spite of their science and differences, the antiquity had the world picture that everything was governed by divine forces. After antiquity, science decayed, and it would go 1500 years before Aristotle was rediscovered in Europe. The migration period in Europe from the fall of the Roman Empire to the early Middle Ages was marked by profound changes. It was also a period when science was ignored, ideas forgotten, and books simply locked away.
After a long period of decay, there is a renewed interest in science in Europe, and it manifests itself around 1150 with the establishment of the new European universities, first in Bologna and then in Oxford and here in Paris.
Universities derive the name from a Latin concept of community of teachers and scholars. The universities grew out of clerical school that got permission to give higher education. In the Middle Ages that followed the Roman Empire, the Church gradually built and rebuilt institutions in Europe. It was the Church that controlled the teaching institutions where intellectual discussions took place. By this, the Catholic Church gained control over science.
The Church was sitting on all authority in Europe. At the Church, in the Church institutions, was the libraries, the learned people, the researchers, and of course the theologians. And the Church had its hand of all kind of knowledge.
The Church was in a dilemma. It supported development of knowledge, but for natural reasons would not allow ideas that could compete with the Bible and their world picture. In this picture, the earth was in the center and everything was ranked according to its relation to God. However, after 1100, the Church started to take a more liberal view on what was acceptable. Aristotle was again relevant.
And the good intention behind this is that the Church should care about nature. And who was the expert on nature? It was, of course, Aristotle.
One of the scholastics that influenced the way the Catholic Church adopted Aristotelian thinking was Thomas Aquinas. In the mid-1200s, he came to the University of Paris, first as a student, and later as a teacher. He found that the systematic logic of religious thinking could be combined with Aristotle's method of classification. He wrote, "It is natural to a human being to attain to what is intelligible through objects of senses, because our knowledge originates from senses." Now a discussion started about science, but on the Church's premises.
One of the scholars that came to the University of Paris in the earlier period was Roger Bacon. He came here in 1237, and his work came to have a lasting influence on science. He developed a new perspectives on method in order to study nature.
Roger Bacon argued that we should open up the fields that Aristotle had investigated and look at them in a new and more systematic way, not only observing, but also experimenting. He got interested in optics because he believed that we need instruments to help us look deeper into things, like the microscope, or wider on things, like the telescope. This inspired the new interest in the ideas of the antiquity, which would define the next 300 years in Europe, the Renaissance. This new liberty to study things culminated when Nicholas Copernicus in 1443 published his book on the revolutions of the celestial spheres. Here he presented his heliocentric hypothesis that the Earth circulates the Sun and not the other way around. It was presented as a theory, but would create a lot of controversies for the next 200 years. It inspired scholars to study the planetary system and thereby became the start of the scientific revolution. This was a revolution that would gradually question Aristotle's research. And, as the Catholic Church had identified with Aristotle, it was on the defensive when Aristotle's findings were proven wrong.
And now this Church's authority was shaken, and people was bewildered because the Church had done something wrong, and Aristotle was the reason. So now the people looked around for some new ground to stand on.
They would increasingly find that ground in science. During the Renaissance, research activities had spread and was done in different places, not only in universities, but at courts and in laboratories. Roger Bacon had discovered gunpowder. Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing machine in 1439, making books more available. Astronomers had redefined the Earth's place in the universe, and Christopher Columbus used new insight in navigation to sail to America in 1492. There was power in scientific knowledge. Kings, princes, and wealthy families like the Medicis in Florence hired scientists in order to invent new things. Science and research was now spread all around Europe.
The scientific revolution that happened during the Renaissance period had convinced people about the power of scientific discovery. And from there on, science gained a much more independent position in society as an independent institution and was allowed to develop on its own account.
The new discoveries in science were made both by better techniques and instruments to observe things, but also through application of mathematics and logic.
In a way, the great authorities leave the scene, and the discovery of the universe becomes something that everyone can try to participate in. And that was in itself a kind of revolution. And this is a part of this change of perspective which came in the Renaissance, that you put man, the human being, the ordinary human being, in the center. Not God, not the authorities, but man, any man.
What follows has been called the Enlightenment Period. It's a period where people in general became more educated and more engaged in scientific discoveries. New branches of science appear and new discoveries are made in fields like biology and medicine. It is also a period where the universities develop and where both universities and science are struggling for independence. The Enlightenment period becomes a new start for science. The Renaissance had corrected many of Aristotle's observations. Now was the time to take reckoning both with the whole philosophy of knowledge that Aristotle and Plato had based their ideas on, and also with the Catholic and medieval worldview that had dominated Europe for 1,000 years. The man that more than others would take that role was a French lawyer and mathematician, Rene Descartes. One of the main things he had to sort out was the relation between the physical world and metaphysics.
Descartes used the metaphor of a tree to describe the relationship between metaphysics and physics. The roots of the tree is like metaphysics. We cannot see them, but we can imagine how they are. The trunk of the tree is like physics. That is something we can observe.
By this argument, Descartes managed to make a divide between our mental existence, our mind, thoughts, religion and beliefs, and our physical existence. This dualism decoupled the study of the physical world from metaphysical speculation. For Descartes, the physical world consisted of mechanics, medicine, and ethics. But Descartes also strived to establish the foundation for metaphysics.
So he was a very ambitious man, and he was certain that he had found the answer. And the answer lay in one single axiom. There's one thing I can be sure of, and that is I am thinking. Even if I'm doubting everything, I'm still thinking, because doubt is a kind of thinking. And because I'm thinking, I know that I exist, and that is my basic axiom to try to understand myself and the world.
The revolutionary with Descartes' philosophy is that it puts man's thinking in the center of everything, not God, not the world, not the divine. Science and philosophy is simply our human mind's attempt to understand the world. Science is human thinking about the world. Thus, he gives science a new start. However, his dualism would become controversial up to our own time.
In the early 17th century, science had to be able to proceed without worrying about religion. So they had a division of the territory. Descartes gave God, the soul, and immortality to religion, and the physical world was the property of science.
The dualism of Descartes would lead to a divide that would set the scene for the further development of science.
We're about to take the train now from Paris to London. It's a journey that takes a little bit more than 2 hours. But in terms of philosophy, we are moving from one world to the other. While continental philosophy continued to be concerned with what Descartes had discussed, namely the epistemological issues related to the relationship between metaphysics and physics, in the British philosophy, one more or less neglected the whole metaphysical discussion and concentrated on the visible world that we can experience, what we will call empiricism.
The man that inspired empiricism in Britain was Francis Bacon. He was a student at Trinity College in Cambridge. In his book, The New Scientific Method, published in 1620, he criticized Plato for his unfounded idea theory, and Aristotle for unfounded categorizing. About Aristotle he wrote, "He corrupted natural philosophy by logic. Thus he formed the world of categories." Bacon called for a new way of doing science, purely based on observation. This new scientific method was called induction.
The perspective of Francis Bacon was not that we study nature in order to understand nature as nature. We study nature from the perspective of being human being. We study it from the perspective of man.
So, Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes were both part of the Enlightenment period and shared this new vision of science as being man's thinking of the world. But Bacon did not believe that we can gain knowledge from thinking alone.
Actually, the right way of producing knowledge is to thoroughly study, investigate, experiment and so on, and gradually build up knowledge about the phenomena where you get more and more verification of the truth of something. And through that, science could produce truth, and as he formulated also in this book, knowledge is power.
Truths from knowledge becomes extremely powerful. And that is also more or less the slogan of the Enlightenment period. But the disagreement about how to reason about knowledge would be a new, big methodological dispute in the history of science, the one between induction and deduction. And it was a dispute that would continue even after some of the greatest scientific discoveries were made by Isaac Newton in the second half of the 17th century. He became known for being able to give a mathematical description to phenomena.
One was a basic equation of mechanics. And mechanics is a science about how things move when they are subject to forces. The other was a mathematical description of one of the most important forces of the world, namely gravitation.
Modern science had tried to rid itself of metaphysics and superstition. One of the big questions that had occupied minds for thousands of years and led to speculations of divine forces was how we can explain the movement of things, from planets to small objects. With Newton's discoveries, this problem seems to have been solved.
So Newton shaped the science for hundreds of years to come. And he was the founder of physics, which was the valid physics until the 20th century.
Still, in the debate on philosophy of science, the discussion was, how did Newton manage to reach his conclusions? Did his discoveries represent induction or deduction? Philosophers at both sides of the canal would engage in this discussion.
As science grew in importance throughout the Enlightenment period, one started to invest in universities, in beautiful places like here in Cambridge, and to build houses to celebrate knowledge and science, like the Wren Library that we see in the background.
While libraries in the medieval time often had been dark, hidden, and sometimes forbidden to enter, the idea of the Wren Library was openness, space, and light. Knowledge in the form of books should be accessible to everyone.
The window on the south wall behind me is called the Cipriani Window. It's a painted glass window designed by Giambattista Cipriani in the 1770s. And it's very interesting because it shows the king who was on the throne at that time, George III, and behind George III is Britannia. Isaac Newton is being introduced to the king by the Spirit of Trinity, or the Muse of the College. And Francis Bacon is sitting at the bottom right-hand corner, and he's recording the scene for posterity. Now, this is a bit of 17th century fun because both Newton and Bacon were dead by the time George III came to the throne. It's an allegory of Trinity's greatness, because at that time, and that came at the end of a period where the college had decided to memorialise all its great men. At that time, Newton and Bacon were considered the greatest men the college had produced. So this shows Trinity's greatness in the 1770s. And it's a beautiful piece of work, painted glass. The colours change throughout the day because the light in the building is so wonderful. It wasn't a popular window in the 19th century because the Victorians didn't like allegory and they thought the window was a bit gaudy and brash. And there were attempts to have it removed. But thankfully that didn't happen and we can still enjoy it today.
It was a very typical aspect of science in the Enlightenment period that it celebrated its heroes.
This is the death mask of Isaac Newton. This was made immediately after his death. It's all a bit gloomy, isn't it? I don't.
They made it.
They made it, and they took people's hair.
Yeah.
There are several versions of this dotted around.
Even if the Enlightenment celebrated the new heroes, the philosophers and scientists, there was still no agreement among them of what constituted the right way of developing knowledge. The Scottish philosopher David Hume was one of the skeptics among the empiricists. Hume questioned the inductive method. He argued that we cannot know things for sure beyond our immediate observation. An example is the black swan. Even if all swans we observe are white, we cannot rule out the possibility of a black swan. When we form knowledge, we do it as much based on customs and habits as on solid individual reifications from sense impressions. Hume also argued that norms and habits were not necessarily deliberately chosen, but had developed through evolution.
Hume argued that there are two ways in which we can develop knowledge about the world. And these two ways are very often referred to as Hume's fork. On the one hand, we can have knowledge about ideas, and on the other hand, we can have knowledge about facts.
Thereby, Hume rejected Descartes' idea that by doubting I can prove that I think, and thereby deduct truth about the world from thinking.
Hume's great achievement was to show that skepticism cannot be answered within a Cartesian framework. What he didn't do was get out of that framework. And the crucial thing that he could not get out of was that when we perceive something, We actually perceive objects and states of affairs in the world.
At the continent, one observed a debate in Britain, and the man who tried to reconcile the disagreement between Descartes and Hume was Immanuel Kant. He lived his whole life in Königsberg, but published his articles through the University in Berlin, and managed to be one of the Western world's most central thinkers. Kant's achievement was to bring together different ideas that had dominated his time. He disagreed with Francis Bacon and the empiricists, with their claim that all knowledge comes from impressions and experience. He thought that Descartes was right in pointing out the dualism. On the one hand, the question where thinking comes from. On the other hand, the question how we use thinking in practice. But he did not call the answer to the first of these questions metaphysics. Rather, he defined it as the epistemology. Kant agreed that David Hume had pointed at something important. How do we get from specific knowledge to general knowledge?
Kant argued that Isaac Newton could not have made his discovery based on induction. Time and space that are very central in Newton's theory does not come from induction. If we did not have a concept of time and space a priori, we would not be able to perceive it.
We have two capacities in our reason, Kant argued. We have the capacity to understand general and abstract things, and we have the capacity to understand specific things through sensing and experiencing.
If you adopt the assumption all you can ever perceive are your own experiences, then how do you ever get objective knowledge? How do you get knowledge of things in themselves? And in particular, how to get synthetic a priori truths? And his answer was what he called the Copernican Revolution. Instead of seeing our mind having to be responsible to reality, think of reality as having to be responsible to our mind. And then you're off and running. Then you can get synthetic a priori propositions, because what you're dealing with is the capacity of the mind to create representations that give us objective reality. How can there be objective reality? Well, underneath the appearances are things in themselves which we can never know, but we have to suppose that they're there.
Descartes, Hume, and Kant would continue to be main references in philosophy of science in the centuries to come, and their disagreement would dominate the discussion in Europe of what science is. They represented three main directions in philosophical thinking that had impact on the three main discourses in three different countries: Descartes and rationalism in France, Hume and empiricism in Britain, and Kant and idealism in Germany. During the Enlightenment period, society has developed, and across Europe there is progress both in technology and in economic, political, and social institutions. At the same time that Kant sits in Königsberg and thinks. At the University of Glasgow in Scotland, James Watt invents the steam engine, and Adam Smith is sorting out the economic principles of industrial production. Scientific discovery started to materialize in technical and social improvements, thus anticipating the Industrial Revolution. Kant celebrated Enlightenment and gave Frederick the Great credit for having introduced individual freedom, freedom of speech, and the rule of law during his reign as King of Prussia. It is the free thinking among free persons that constituted Enlightenment.
A good expression of the Enlightenment period is this Pantheon Building in Paris. This architecture is harmonic and symmetric, and with references to Greek and Roman times, which is also was the case of the Enlightenment period. And also this was a building that originally was attended as a church, but in 1791 during the French Revolution it was converted into a celebration hall for French thinkers, and also you could say for French thinking.
We have so far followed European science over a more than 2,000 years history, from its beginning in the antiquity, through its revival in the Middle Ages, and into the scientific revolution in the Renaissance. From then on, we have seen how science developed as a more and more independent institution, liberating itself from the dominance of the Church, questioning many of the ideas of antiquity, opening new areas of research, and trying to establish a philosophical foundation for scientific knowledge. After the French Revolution, as we move into the 19th century, science would increasingly be influencing society, and the discussion about what is scientific knowledge would continue.